Dear friends, I now come to the third part of the four most important aspects of my criminal complaint filed with the Federal Prosecutor's Office some 6 weeks ago and published internationally at the same time. This is part number 3, and it deals with white torture. Now, if you count the introduction, then this would be part number 4. But if you only look at the four most important legal aspects that I'm talking about, then this is the third part. The first part was the illegal and false arrest warrant. The second part was the replacement of the original charges. And this is the third part, white torture, and then comes the kidnapping. So what was this white torture about? It lasted for 6 months and included, among other things, 6 months of solitary confinement, getting handcuffed and shackled for transportation between the prison and the court, accompanied by heavily armed correction officers and heavily armed police officers in 3, sometimes 4 or 5 vans driving in front of and behind the vehicle in which I was transported. But it also included the refusal to let me see my dying mother and the refusal to allow me to be at her funeral, etc. This English version of my statement on white torture will be more succinct and concise than the German version. And that's because I just realized that when I think about then write about this particular topic, I get very angry. And I suppose that's okay, but I don't want to be consumed by that anger. Rather, I want to keep my cool and then calmly explain who is responsible for what crime so that the boomerangs of justice will not miss their targets. The strange thing about all these measures is that they were based on orders by the presiding Judge Schindler and the 2 women directors of the prison, Dr. Jacob and Mrs. Luther. It's a kind of a joint venture in a way. But the strange thing is that we, the defense, were not given any explanation, let alone justification, for these measures when they were suddenly and unexpectedly imposed on me on May the 3rd, 2024. And that's very unusual because you've probably heard of the concept notice and a hearing. Whenever the state, the government, for example, takes anything away from you, for example, your driver's license, they first must give you a notice by, for example, telling you, oh, you guy ran a red light for the 3rd time, and then they must give you an opportunity to present your side of the story. That's the hearing. So you might, for example, say, it wasn't me, it was somebody else. In this particular context, here in pretrial detention, this is especially important because pretrial detention should not be punishment. And there shouldn't be punishment inside this pretrial detention either. Only when finally pressure from the public and the defense had gotten so intense that they could not keep this up any longer, they suddenly, after 6 months, on November the 24th, dropped them and sent us a written attempt at explaining the reasons for this extraordinary and never before practiced treatment of a presumed to be innocent prisoner in pretrial detention at this facility in Rostorf. Now, how do I know this? How do I know that this had never been practiced before? Well, it is the correction officers, some of whom are almost openly on my side, and 2 of them volunteered to testify in court if it ever comes to a legal proceeding against the perpetrators. And they told me that not even those prisoners who had been sentenced and whose sentence had become final and who had been sentenced for the most heinous crimes, not even these people, not one of them, was ever submitted to these measures of white torture. But on the basis of an expert legal opinion by a Polish-British human rights organization, it is now clear that this white torture was not only completely illegal and constitutes a grave violation of human rights as guaranteed both by the EU and the UN, But this also gives rise to civil damages worth millions of euros or dollars, depending on where we file such a complaint for damages, civil complaint for damages. We have yet to decide which one of these last two crimes, the white torture or the kidnapping, which I'll get into in the fourth and final part of my oral presentation of the four most important aspects of my criminal complaint, which one of these last two crimes will ultimately turn out to be the most bizarre and most malicious one. But one thing is certain. For neither one of these crimes is there any justification, like self-defense, or even excuse the perpetrators can invoke. As far as that is concerned, however, there is no justification for the first two crimes either, neither for the false arrest and false imprisonment on the basis of a completely false and freely invented arrest warrant, nor for the abrupt replacement of the original false charges with completely new, freely invented false charges when after 4 months into the trial it turned out that there was nothing even remotely criminal about anything I had done. But for these first two crimes, they could, at least in theory, try to plead insanity because of the gaping holes in the frontal lobes of their brains caused by the vaccinations, or perhaps more appropriately, as Denny Crane might recommend, because of mad cow disease. So here's what I'm going to do now. I'll first explain what exactly the monsters and their puppets actually did. Then, based on the above-mentioned expert legal opinion, I will explain the legal basis for pre-trial detention, which in my case does not exist. There is no legal justification for my pre-trial detention, except, of course, spite and malice, the monsters' spite and malice. And finally, I will give you the very straightforward legal analysis or assessment by the panel of experts of this organization, assessment of the very, very strange attempt by psychopathic and sociopathic criminals to justify their crimes. Just to make this clear, my diagnosis of two directors of the prison, one as being a psychopath and the other a sociopath, is based on 15 years of professional experience in medical and pharmaceutical law. And I told both women, one of them claims that she's a psychologist, what I thought of them when there was no doubt left in my mind who I was dealing with and how it had been exactly this kind of women, this type of women, who prisoners in the concentration camps had every reason to be afraid of. But I was not afraid. I was only getting very angry. So what exactly happened? Let me quickly take another look at the backdrop of all this. After my abduction in Mexico on October the 11th of 2023, I was flown to Frankfurt Airport, where I was finally, on October the 13th, presented with an arrest warrant, which, as I immediately saw, was completely false. However, it took my captors more than 2 weeks to ship me to Göttingen, which is only a 2-hour drive from Frankfurt, provide my defense lawyers with at least part of the prosecution's case file. To this day, the prosecution is withholding crucial parts of their file and their evidence. And finally, on November the 1st, 2023, to give me a hearing. But this hearing was before the very judge who had auto-signed with his auto pen the prosecution's false arrest warrant. As I have explained in my first statement about the illegally issued, that is in violation of EU law issued, and completely false arrest warrant, we were on November the 1st, 2023, able to show that each and every one of the accusations in the arrest warrant was false, but to no avail. Instead of throwing the case out and letting me go, which is what should and would have happened had this not been a political case, they kept me in pretrial detention. That is when it became absolutely clear to me that this was, of course, a fake political case and that the criminal justice part of the Göttingen judiciary had indeed, just as was described in a New York Times article of 2022 or 2021, become criminal justice, criminal in the true sense of the word. It took my defense team almost 6 months until May the 3rd of 2024 to arrive at that same conclusion. I had, of course, an advantage over them because I had all the time in the world to go through carefully over and over again through that convoluted file. Now, you need to know that at Rostov prison, there's one wing where all those prisoners are kept that are after having been sentenced and their sentence having become final, serving time. And then there's another wing of the prison where all those roughly 80 or so people are kept who are presumed to be innocent. That is, those prisoners who are accused of having committed a crime, often without even an indictment, and who are, instead of being allowed to defend themselves from their own homes in freedom, that is, kept in pretrial detention. You may think, hey, isn't pretrial detention only for people who are accused of having committed violent crimes such as murder or assault and battery or armed robbery, something like that? True. Then how come that I, who was merely accused of not having paid back a corporate loan, had been put in pretrial detention in a maximum security prison? Very good question, especially when you figure in that it very quickly became a matter of judicial notice even that I had been in the process of paying back that loan when the 3 Berlin criminals, after having filed their completely false and baseless criminal complaint, had, with the help of the prosecution, stolen my money so that I would not be able to pay back the loan. But you'll remember that's another story. It is, however, another important piece of this 4-part puzzle that will break the German criminal justice system's back. Back to the topic at hand now. The new arrivals who are to be in pretrial detention in Rostov first come in and are incarcerated in one of the 20 cell rooms on level 0 or ground 0, as some call it. The detainees on ground 0 are isolated from all the other prisoners on the 3 normal floors or wings above them, floors 1 through 3. They are not allowed to have any contact with them, while the normal detainees of floors 1 through 3 can talk to anyone and get to mingle with each other when they get their 1 hour per day dose of walking in the prison courtyard. All the new arrivals are kept on ground 0 for 2 to 3 weeks, apparently to determine whether the countless drug and alcohol addicts among them can be controlled in this environment or if they should be held in one of the bunker cells with nothing in them, no furniture at all, but with 24-hour camera surveillance. Then, after 2 to 3 weeks, every one of the new arrivals is transferred to one of the normal wings, that is to floors 1 through 3. But ground 0 is not only for the new arrivals, but also for those detainees who are dangerous for themselves or the other inmates. Child molesters or rapists, or rather men who are accused of having committed such crimes, but also men who have shown themselves to be traitors, that is, to cooperate with the prison system to curry favor with, for example, the directors, are also kept there. Why? Because as such, they are at the very lowest rung of the prison ladder. Everyone else despises them. Some, often men who have children of their own, beat them up or even try to kill them. The public, however, doesn't know anything about this. And if something does happen, it is kept from the public. It does not appear in the papers, and if a criminal complaint is filed, that complaint either disappears or the Göttingen DA's office dispenses of such complaints by simply writing one sentence stating that there's no probable cause for an investigation. So there I was now, quickly learning the ropes of prison life and pretty much getting along with everyone as I was able to help many of the prisoners and their attorneys write drafts for their briefs or for their pleadings, or explain to those prisoners who did not speak any German and or did not have competent legal representation to understand what their case was about and get competent legal representation. I did begin to wonder what was going on when, after 3 months on ground 0, I had still not been transferred to one of the normal wings of pretrial detention. This was annoying because I was kept in a corner cell and it was very cold there as it was winter. Also, I was anxious to talk to the other normal detainees. Finally, after having watched in amazement how some of the detainees of Ground Zero were yelled at and then disciplined with 2 or 3 days of solitary confinement simply because they had dared talk to one of the normal inmates through their barred window openings while taking advantage of the daily 1-hour dose of fresh air, finally it dawned on me that there was something very wrong with that prison at Rostorf. Sure enough, when eventually, after having spent more than 5 months on Ground Zero, that is roughly 7 times as long as all the others, when I was transferred to floor number 2, I very quickly understood, because I was instructed by some of the more seasoned inmates, that is those who had seen it all, that this prison, Rostov, is, by them, considered a concentration camp or a special prison for psychiatric experiments that were conducted on the inmates as unwitting lab rats. Now things began to make sense to me. However, for about 2 months, until May the 3rd, 2024, life in prison was a lot easier to endure, as I now, being on this normal floor, 2, met many very interesting prisoners who I enjoyed talking with. Of course, you hear a lot of wild stories inside a prison, but if you want to know if a story is true, all you need to do is look at their papers. The arrest warrant, the indictment, if there is one, or, if they're lucky to have it, the prosecution's case file. This gave me deep insights into the totally corrupt criminal justice system in Germany and the even worse criminal justice system, the really criminal justice system in Göttingen. What I learned there was later confirmed by a police officer. I met him in pretrial detention because he too had been thrown into pretrial detention, a police officer who had been thrown under the bus by his superiors because he had found out that a huge percentage of drug enforcement agents in a certain big city in Germany were either drug addicts themselves and or cooperating with the drug dealers and making truckloads of extra money. When I then met a prosecutor, also in pretrial detention, who had also been thrown under the bus because he knew too much, I learned that roughly 15 to 20% of all prosecutors in Germany are corrupt, and that the same is probably true for the system's judges. All the others who are not themselves corrupt, and that was the most disturbing part of that story, know what is going on, but stay silent because they're afraid. Remember the quote by Pastor Martin Niemöller? I didn't stand up and I didn't speak up when they came for the Jews, and because I wasn't a Jew, I didn't speak up when they came for the Catholics because I was a Protestant, and finally when they came for me, there was no one to speak up for me. And I think those prosecutors and judges who we cooperate with behind the scenes, I think they're beginning to understand this. That's why these messages seem to be really important. So, there is a kind of a stalemate between the representatives of the law, on the one hand, and the criminals on the other hand, as there are lists, believe it or not, lists with all the names of the prosecutors and judges and police officers who either consume drugs themselves or are paid off to turn a blind eye, or even warn the drug dealers of impending raids. But there are also photographs and videos of those judges and prosecutors who are involved in much worse sexual abuse of children, for example. From what I was able to observe, roughly 80% of the prisoners at Rostov prison, that includes both people who are held in pretrial detention and those who are already serving sentences, roughly 80% are foreigners, many of whom had little or no command of the German language and who, in my view, were often represented by public defenders assigned to them by the court who were both incompetent and uninterested. Not all of them, but many are. but who cooperated very closely with the prosecution and the court against their own clients. Now, if you look at these numbers, 80% of the prisoners, not just at Rostorf prison, but at all the other prisons as well, how did that come? What's the reason for that? Well, I think there's a very helpful piece of brand new news, which was published by Viktor Orban of Hungary. He just stated that it was George Soros who, with his NGOs, had planned to swamp European countries with 1 million people from Africa and the Middle East per year, and starting in 2015. Looks like Angela Merkel and all the others did the bidding of George Soros and maybe Bill Gates. We'll see about that. If you remember, my 75, now probably 76-year-old friend Bodo Schminke, who had tried to commit suicide when he was arrested for having attempted to hold up the bank with a toy gun because he couldn't pay for his car's exhaust test, and there's no money in the German Social Security coffers anymore because it's all either in Ukraine or in Israel or has been spent on Social Security for foreigners. My friend Bodo Schminke was one of these people who did not have competent legal representation. I'll get back to him in a moment. I was also able to determine that 3 of the 5 doctors who were in charge of medical services at Rostorf prison were just as incompetent and uninterested as most of, not all, but most of the court-appointed public defenders. The head of the medical department, Mr. Frank, for many years had made a name for himself as being the world's most incompetent medical doctor. His errors were so horrendous that one of my fellow inmates, who had quickly been carted off to another prison after Mr. Frank's medical malpractice had almost cost him his life, was urgently advised by that other prison's doctor to file criminal charges against Mr. Frank. That other doctor is also ready to testify in court, just as 1 or probably 2 of the doctors at Rostorf prison. Another fellow inmate who, after having fallen from a scaffolding, had sustained very serious back injuries that required surgery, which was botched, so that this inmate was on pain medication, he suffered a stroke when Frank abruptly took him off all medication. He survived only because real doctors at one of Göttingen's hospitals saved his life. You do not abruptly take anyone off medication. You slowly wean them off. It's called tapering. This inmate did file a criminal complaint, but it was either completely ignored or summarily dismissed without any investigation at all. My friend Bodo Schminke, by the way, was, after the prison directors realized that he and I had been talking a lot, transferred to another prison. Guess which one? To Bremerförde, which is where I am now. He was actually on the same floor that I'm on now. And some of the inmates who met him back then told me what happened to him. Here, on this floor, he once again attempted to take his own life. This time, he was trying to play it safe, and he slit his wrist and cut a vein on his temple. But again, they found him just in time to save his life, as those fellow prisoners had seen blood seeping out into the hallway from under his door. Even though he had lost more than 2 liters of blood, he was unable to concentrate on anything, taken to court in Göttingen 2 days later. Now, rumor has it that in Göttingen, they even put dead people on trial. You know, that's what those 12-volt batteries are there for, to jumpstart them in the morning. Shortly before I was transferred from Göttingen to Bremerförde, I met him again and made sure that Katja Wörmer, my lead attorney, is now representing him too. So that kind of sets the stage for what to expect now in my peculiar case. After a little less than 2 months on floor 2, one of the normal floors, came Friday, May the 3rd, 2024, the infamous day on which Judge Schindler announced that from then on the case would not be about illegal corporate loans anymore, but rather he had just come to the conclusion that this case wasn't about loans at all. But not to worry, He had come up with something brand new, this time with something that wouldn't even require a defense, and it was absolutely clear beyond any unreasonable doubt that I was guilty of having violated a secret trust agreement. A secret trust agreement that, unlike the loan contracts, which didn't matter anymore, didn't exist in writing, nor had it been entered into orally, but as it clearly existed in Schindler's head and had not escaped through one of the many gaping holes in his frontal lobes quite yet, it was the truth and nothing but the truth, and therefore he would now shut down the proceeding, not hear any more witnesses, let alone any of the defense's witnesses, but was more than happy, he said, to hear the defense's closing arguments. Now, that did not exactly bode well for my immediate future, and so I readied myself for more of the same to come. And Schindler did not disappoint us. Claiming that he had felt threatened by an anonymous email he had received, or he claims to have received, probably from the same anonymous email writer who, it turned out later, was also the totally crazy author of the criminal complaint of September the 2nd, 2022, he and the two directors of the prison decided to immediately transfer me back to ground zero. And to guarantee that the fun wouldn't end there, they put me in solitary confinement indefinitely. For the first couple of days, they claimed, this was necessary because I was not to know about a birthday party that was going to be celebrated just outside the prison on May 5th by some of the people who were supporting me, and whose collaboration had been formally permitted by the Göttingen authorities as a perfectly legal demonstration. Still, I was not to know anything about it. But as Schindler, the psychopath, and the sociopath had learned through telepathy that had trickled into their brains through the aforementioned holes in their frontal lobes, there was a clear and present danger that the songs and the music played for my birthday would contain secret messages for me, messages that might present a serious risk of harm caused to something or someone that the bad, the crazy, and the very crazy could not quite describe yet, but would recognize when they saw it, or something along those lines. Also, from then on, I was no longer transported together with other pretrial detainees to and from court, but alone, matching my solitary confinement. The officers who drove me to the court in Göttingen and back, plus a bunch of police officers who from then on accompanied us, traveling in front of and behind the bus in which I traveled, were all heavily armed with pistols and machine guns, and also protected by bulletproof vests. When I was offered a vest for my protection, I thanked them but declined and told them that I felt perfectly safe and that it appeared to me that this show was simply put on to make the general public, the ones with the holes in their heads, believe that I was a very dangerous terrorist. I was then told that if I didn't want to wear a bulletproof vest, I needed to sign a special form, and if I signed it, that I was then deemed to be aware of the risk of getting hit by friendly fire, that is, by a stray bullet from one of the police officers or the correction officers or the police that might accidentally hit and kill me. I told them that I didn't believe in such accidents and that this exceedingly stupid form would not make anyone immune from being held responsible later by me, either in civil court or in criminal court. But I also told them that I hadn't lost my sense of humor and that I would probably be having a glass of beer with those correction officers, judges, and the prosecution who I was in touch with behind the scenes, who were supporting me until I will get out of here. However, when you keep signing this form and keep getting warned that a stray bullet might hit and kill you, and when this happens for the 50th time, and always in connection with once more having to confront a true monster, that is the criminal Judge Schindler and his cronies, you do begin to consider serious offers from professionals who are willing to make sure that real justice is done. I'll not get into the details. However, despite the fact that there was no doubt at all that I was in a self-defense situation, which translates into a defense of others situation for the offeror of that alternative justice, I decided to stay calm and, thanking the offerors, turned such offers down. But then my sister told me that my mother was dying and probably only had a week or 10 days to live, and that I should immediately come to see her one last time. But they refused to let me see her one more time. So she died, and I was not able to see my mother one more time. And then they wouldn't allow me to be at her funeral, a sea burial which she, like my father before her, had wanted for herself. And that is when I decided that I would not let anyone get away, no one who had been involved in this. But that, of course, ate at me for a while, and I became ill and asked for medical attention one day when I was supposed to go to court. Instead of giving me that medical attention in the medical department of the prison, I was taken by 2 armed correction officers with guns and machine guns, accompanied by 3 minibuses with equally armed police officers, to the private practice of Mr. Frank. There, his mostly elderly, normal patients looked at me shocked, because I was handcuffed and shackled, but I apparently didn't look the part that Schindler, the psychopath, and the sociopath wanted me to play. I looked like a normal person. I was then taken into one of the treatment rooms, or examination rooms rather, of Mr. Frank, still accompanied by 2 officers with their guns, one of the machine guns being pointed at me, and then I was asked by Frank to tell him what bothered me. Weird. His hands were shaking so badly that he stuck them between his legs so that I couldn't see it. I thought it was out of fear that he had now exposed himself so indecently that he would be easy prey for a tort lawyer like me. But later, when I had returned from court, of course he found me to be perfectly fit for trial. Why should he not? Even people who had lost more than 2 liters of blood and dead people are fit for trial in Göttingen. Later I was told by 3 fellow inmates that his hands shaking was not a result of fear, but because he too is a drug and alcohol addict. We'll see about that. They then ramped up their white torture by placing a very seriously disturbed young guy who was suffering from paranoid schizophrenia right next to my cell. Even the correction officers knew and told me numerous times that this guy didn't belong in prison, but desperately needed therapy. However, he stayed there for weeks, screaming and yelling at the top of his lungs in the middle of the night, and every once in a while smashing everything in his cell to smithereens, the bed, the chair, the closet, even the sink and the toilet bowl, until finally it became impossible to keep him there, and he was, I was told, taken to a psychiatric hospital. Who knows what really happened to him? From what I had seen happen both in court and in the prison, he might have been euthanized. At that point, I didn't care. I was just happy to be able to sleep again. However, the judge, the psychopath, and the sociopath and their puppets in prison made sure that entertainment on ground zero would not suddenly stop. Another new arrival was placed in the cell right next to mine, and everyone was told that this guy from Africa was a violent person, and that we shouldn't even talk to him. Since I was still in solitary confinement, I didn't really care. However, at one point, when I picked up lunch, he too had been let out of his cell and was ready to attack me with his tray. When I had just made up my mind that I would need to use what I had learned as a soldier in officers training and kill him, one of the correction officers stepped in and told me that he'd had it, not with me, but with the situation, that he would strongly advise me to file a criminal complaint concerning what was going on ground zero. I did, but you guessed it, again, to no avail. This officer, too, will testify in my favor, he says, when the time comes. But the African prisoner was right after this incident hauled away, chained and shackled and strapped to a kind of cart, sort of like Hannibal Lecter. Bizarre, really bizarre. Well, I believe you now have an understanding what white torture means. Let me now turn to that Polish-British human rights agencies or organizations' expert legal opinion that took a very close look at my pretrial detention and at the treatment I enjoyed there. The name of that human rights organization is United for Freedom Limited. They are active in the field of the protection of human rights defenders, and this activity is based, among other things, on the human rights regulations of the United Nations and the EU. Due to my work first on the Corona Investigative Committee and then on ICIC, I am, as the report states on page 11, considered both a human rights defender and a journalist. United for Freedom primarily reviews the actions of the police and the judiciary. Their primary focus is on the protection of human rights, of course. However, the legal situation at the federal and state levels in Germany is also taken into account, as is stated at the very beginning of the report. The report starts out by pointing out that, according to the findings of the European Parliament's Research Service in a document from March 2023, the situation of human rights defenders and journalists remains extremely threatening. In 2021, 358 human rights defenders from 35 different countries were killed because of their work. The most common risks include arbitrary detention, torture, false accusations, political measures and legislation restricting their work, restrictions on freedom of expression, unauthorized searches, and attacks on homes and families. However, in 2022, only 15 of the 193 member states of the United Nations, that's 8%, only 15 of the 193 member states of the United Nations, not including, of course, Germany, had taken measures to protect human rights defenders. Then the report takes a closer look at pretrial detention. The report points out that even if pretrial detention is deemed to be formally legal under national law, it may still be arbitrary and even illegal, as the concept of arbitrariness is not synonymous with unlawfulness, but must be interpreted more broadly to include elements of unreasonableness, injustice, lack of predictability and due process, etc., etc. Most importantly, pretrial detention must be necessary and appropriate in all circumstances. For example, the United Nations Human Rights Committee states that pretrial detention is a last resort, that is, a measure that can only be taken when there are no other less serious or less invasive measures to make sure that someone who is accused of having committed a crime will actually come and stand a trial. The rule is, however, that a presumed to be innocent person who is accused of having committed a crime should be able to defend himself without being detained from his own home in freedom, so as to not limit his ability to defend himself. General comment number 35.38 states, therefore, that pretrial detention should be the exception, not the rule. In Germany, the exact opposite is the case. Since in my case, the pretrial detention was preceded by a brazen violation of international law, that is, by a kidnapping, as I will explain in my next, much shorter statement, my pretrial detention is without a doubt arbitrary, not just unlawful, as stated on page 16 of the report. It was not only unlawful because of the kidnapping, but it was also unlawful because it was based on the accusation that I had failed to pay back a loan, which, of course, is not a crime at all. Article 7 of the European Convention on Human Rights prohibits detention without a criminal offense, and Article 11 expressly prohibits imprisonment on the grounds of inability to fulfill a contractual obligation. But that had been precisely the official accusation that had led to my abduction and imprisonment, as the report states on page 14. Just as a reminder, let me add once more to this that the only reason why I had not been able to pay back the loan had been that those very deep state authorities, acting through the three agents for the German Domestic Intelligence Service and Prosecutor John, who we were trying to protect the donation money from, those very people had stolen all of my money, plus a large chunk of my client's money, so that I wouldn't be able to pay back the loan. That's how crazy that situation really is. Even Judge Schindler had to admit in writing that the three idiots from Berlin who had stolen that money had no right to do that, of course, and that I would have paid back the loan if they hadn't stolen it. The report continues by pointing out that according to Article 3 of the European Convention on Human Rights and Article 7 and 9 of the ICCPR, that's the International Convention on Political whatever, pretrial detention should only be used if no milder or less intrusive means are available. Here, it would have been possible to use an electronic ankle bracelet, as they're available even in Germany, including in the state of Lower Saxony, which, if I remember correctly, is a part of Germany. Judge Schindler simply lied when he said in court that this was not possible. Again, it needs to be pointed out in this context that I had not been accused of a violent crime or even a felony. Then the report goes on to discuss the utterly ridiculous, yes, embarrassing efforts of the prison directors, the psychopath and the sociopath, in this case, the sociopath Luther, to justify the above summarized measures in a statement dated November 2024. Of course, such measures cannot be justified under any circumstance. And that is the reason why no other prison inmate at Rostov prison had ever been subjected to such measures before, as even the psychopath who claims to be the prison director admitted shortly before I told her that she was, in my professional opinion, a psychopath. Analyzing the sociopath statement, the report starts out by explaining that pretrial detention must obviously not be used as punishment, but had been used as punishment in my case. But for what crimes, the report asks? None, the report summarily finds, and then says on page 22 and page 23, before going into the details of the prison officials' pathetic attempt at justifying what cannot be justified, while the statement by Rostov prison is written in such a polemical manner, that one can assume a definite aversion or hostility on the part of the authors of that paper towards Dr. Fürmich, one must strongly doubt their objectivity, sound understanding of the law, empathy, and fairness in dealing with prisoners such as Dr. Fürmich. The high level of criminal energy extends to the highest superiors of the prison staff, the Secretary of Justice of the state of Lower Saxony, Dr. Katrin Wallmann, and Dr. Stephanie Springer, who is responsible for the prison system. This, in connection with the inhumane actions and practices that violate human rights, which we have observed and documented in the state of Lower Saxony to date, gives rise to the suspicion that there, victims are made into perpetrators of whatever. So they must have been watching this state of Lower Saxony's practices for quite a long period of time. Then United for Freedom goes into the details of the prison's attempts at justifying what cannot be justified. I'll give you just a few examples so as not to bore you to death. One of the more ridiculous attempts at justifying the white torture measures is their pointing to my international notoriety, I guess, my reach, and the media presence of some of my supporters. This is United for Freedom in their report on page 26, the attempt to de facto punish me because of my notoriety as one of the frontmen of the resistance against the crimes against humanity committed by those who are responsible for the pandemic. And this violates Article 7 of the European Convention on Human Rights, Article 15 of the ICCPR, and, of course, the German Constitution's Articles 1 and 103 sub 2. The false, as even Judge Schindler had to admit, accusation by the prison authorities that I illegally provided legal advice to the fellow prisoners is equally ridiculous, as the report points out on page 26. It states there, every person has the right to a fair hearing and to legal advice. Dr. Fomich should be credited for providing legal advice to prisoners, informing them of their rights, and thus standing up for the socially disadvantaged. The attempt to prevent this once again highlights the pathological behavior of the prison officials at Rostorf prison, some of whom do not even seem capable of formulating a complete and reasonable sentence in German. Now, I would like to add that this does not apply to all of them, but it certainly does to some, the psychopaths and the sociopaths included. The report continues, the arrogance with which Dr.Reinhard Fomich is ridiculed and mocked because of his status as a fully qualified lawyer and doctor of law must also be considered as degrading or demeaning treatment under Article 3 of the European Convention on Human Rights and Article 7 of the ICCPR. According to the so-called Nelson Mandela Rule, specifically Rule 61.23.3, the report continues, a prison must inform all prisoners if there is anyone who provides free legal advice. Let this suffice. I'll spare you the rest, as it is more than obvious that with the monsters subjecting me to the above summarized measures of white torture, and they're making things even worse by attempting to justify this in the most ridiculous and even pathetic manner anyone can think of, they only succeeded in painting bullseyes on their asses, as Denny Crane would say, and thereby making sure that the boomerangs of justice will not miss their targets. The report ends by stating that it goes without saying that under such conditions as I was made to endure at Rostorf prison, it was next to impossible for me to adequately prepare for and assist with my defense in my trial, as is required by Article 6 of I think it's the European Convention on Human Rights, and Article 14 of the ICCPR. But that, I want to add, is precisely the point of all this, to destroy my capacity to defend myself. And this also explains why Judge Schindler refused to stay or pause the proceeding when we moved for such a stay or pause in order to have me examined by an expert on traumatology to determine whether or not I was still able to stand trial. He and his handlers wanted to make sure that I would be unable to defend myself. And that is why what Judge Schindler, the sociopaths and the psychopaths and their little helpers did will prove to be a very costly mistake. My fourth and final statement will be much shorter than this one. It will deal with the kidnapping and with the fact that the German puppet government was behind it, including the former German Secretary of State, who is now President of the General Assembly of the United Nations. The fallout from this alone cannot be contained. You'll see that I have taken all necessary steps to make sure that it will not be contained. I would love to meet Denny Crane or Bill Shatner one day, but I would love to even more see you all very, very soon. Bye-bye.